Since you raised the growth rate, Shekhar, there's been so much discussion, chatter lately, as you know,
Yes.
about the downward revision to the growth in the last quarter of the last year, a lower forecast for this year, and very mediocre forecasts by Morgan Stanley and most investment banks and public institutions for the coming fiscal year. And as someone who works on this and who thinks about it, do you share the concern or the fear that India could be slipping back into a lower growth trajectory, that we might have already had our run of 7 or 8% growth and we're slipping back towards a new so-called Hindu rate of growth, not 3.5, but maybe 5%? The Economist certainly seems to think so. I'm more optimistic that we can still manage 7 or 8, but what's your sense of that?
I'm actually perhaps as optimistic, or perhaps even more so. And the Economist called its leader this week, farewell, incredible India. As I said in my talk, I suspect it should have been au revoir, incredible India. So, till we meet again. So I think it's certainly a diminution of India's star. But as a friend and colleague who writes a weekly column on India, Surjit Bhalla, said to me, he asked around, and 5 years back he asked around, could anybody have predicted India's rising star? And the answer universally was no. And then in the last 6 months he's been polling his friends to say, would you have expected India's star to be falling in the way in which it has? And again, the answer was no. So I think countries and nations go through these cycles. To me, what's of concern is that there is just so much at stake in the case of India. I think the Economist very rightly pointed to the fact that if India is not able to regain its 7, 8, 9, maybe even 10% growth rate, the impact on India is poor, and in general on one of the biggest social transformations that's underway anywhere in the world, could be even bigger than the Eurozone crisis that we are seeing. So I think what's at stake is really, in a sense, the topic of my talk today, that we are in a position, if things fall into place and if the right policies are followed, and if we have a bit of luck on our side, to indeed end poverty in that generation of 10 or 20 or 25 years. And that's within reach. So for me, I think the biggest disappointment comes from, but also the opportunity comes from this wake-up call. I suspect that if this wake-up call is seen as for what it is, there is no doubt in my mind that India still, as the second fastest growing economy in the world, with the huge market that it represents, with the opportunities of the demographic transition that I talked about, with the fact that when the rest of the world is in doldrums at 2, 3 and negative rates of growth, India, alongside China, could still be the favored destination and should be the favored destination of foreign direct investment. Unfortunately, of course, what's happened is that not only have there's a waning of interest on the part of foreigners in India, but also Indian companies are looking abroad so as to get away from some of the pessimism of
onerous regulation, uncertainty, and certainly things that haven't helped the government's reversal on FDI and retail, for instance. If I can just pick up a point that you made, or a couple of things you said. One very crucial, that it's not growth for growth's sake, that growth is a key tool of towards combating poverty and other social ills, something which the Economist also makes, interestingly enough, and they're hardly a left-wing sort of socialist rag, so they recognize that link as well. So how do you see that connection between, is there sort of a mechanical relationship between growth and poverty, or what other policies would have to be put in place to ensure that if we do get back to say 7 or 8% or even higher, that does translate into meaningful reductions in poverty, not to mention the other facet, which is growing wealth and income inequalities?
So clearly there's a established elasticity of poverty reduction with respect to growth, and India's numbers on that elasticity are not terribly bad. So India's reduced poverty between the years 2004-5 to 2009-10 by about 7.5–8%, with greater reductions in rural poverty and somewhat smaller reductions in urban poverty. But the bulk of the Indian poor are rural, so that has a major impact. That's with the 7–8% growth that we've seen. So there is already a built-in momentum that if India were to go back to close to double-digit growth, that would continue to have an impact on poverty. At the same time, I think there is a transformation underway in agriculture, which is releasing low productivity workers from agriculture and allowing them to move into semi-skilled and manufacturing type activities. So I think that's the process that's underway. There's also been major improvements in agricultural capital investments. Those have grown substantially, and you can see that in the higher growth rates of agriculture that we've seen. So these are lots of positives on that front, on this connection between growth and poverty reduction. But a crucial test that's out there is the ability to generate enough jobs. That is, growth that is going to be focused only on services isn't going to meet and take advantage of that demographic transition that we know is happening, is going to happen. There is no stopping it. And to the extent that some of this growth can be in manufacturing, particularly low-skilled manufacturing, it will generate the jobs which will then lead to dramatic reductions in poverty. It will lead to things like income security. It will lead to things like food security. That will release some of the current entitlements that have been built up in India in the last few years, during the years of rapid growth and rapidly rising tax revenues. Those programs possibly could be even scaled back, releasing resources for more investments in skilling, for raising the skill levels of the average Indian worker, of ensuring their ability to compete in a global market. So I can see real knock-on effects if the policy framework is there, if the right decisions are taken, that generates growth and then translates that growth into meaningful poverty reduction, meaningful jobs.